But I think at its core, I think what we can say is that any kind of company out there that is leveraging an open source product has a responsibility to make sure that they're actually giving it back to the world in a way that's a responsible and beneficial situation. I'll give you an example. If a hosting company is using WordPress and they're promoting themselves as a hosting company that offers managed hosting for WordPress, and they're providing a really terrible experience, but they have the capital to go out and acquire tons of customers through advertising, and they have an easy onboarding set up, but they're providing just a terrible experience, that can become the first and only experience that user has with WordPress. And then they end up maybe not going to another hosting company and trying WordPress again, but instead going to another platform altogether. And if that's a closed source platform, that's not good for the internet as a whole. And that's a disservice to the actual community, because you're now taking away what could have been a positive WordPress experience and forcing them to migrate and change platforms altogether. Hey everyone, welcome to Impressive Hosting. I am your host, Jesse Friedman. I have been working in the hosting industry over a decade. I've been working with WordPress for 20 plus years. I currently work at Automatic, and we started this podcast as a way to kind of give back to the agencies and the users out there who are using WordPress, but trying to identify the core tenets of what makes great WordPress hosting. So over the course of many episodes with this podcast, we're going to interview some really amazing people from within the industry. And at the end of it, we're going to compile a list of the core tenets that you want to analyze and look at when you make your next hosting decision. I'm really happy today to have Kevin from ReviewSignal and Vic from MariaDB. We are live right now in this moment, but they're across the world. I'm currently here in Rhode Island. Kevin, you are located where right now?
I'm in Bangkok, Thailand.
That's right. And Vic, you just went on a decent sized journey.
Yep. I just came yesterday from China, and today I am in Bucharest, Romania.
That's amazing. Thank you for joining. Today's episode, we are going to be talking about open source technology, but from a different lens. We're going to be discussing the importance of companies who are making decent revenue or profits off of open source software, and how they can be giving back more and giving back to the open source community to further endow these projects and make sure they're here for the long term. So let's start off with some introductions. Kevin, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on.
I'm Kevin. I'm from ReviewSignal, and ReviewSignal does web hosting reviews. I started that about 12 years ago now, 13 years ago. And the idea was, I've been in the web hosting as a developer, marketer, everything. I made websites for ages, for at least a decade before that, and I could never find any honest web hosting reviews. It was always kind of word of mouth or forums or something, somebody thinks this company's good. There was nothing out there that solved the idea of honest web hosting reviews, and that annoyed me. After that long, it's still not having a solution, so I went out and tried to build it. Original idea was, let's listen to what people are saying, because the way I get information is listening to what other people are saying. If I could build some tech that would do that for me on a scale that was unheard of, like tapping into Twitter, I could figure out what everybody thought of all these companies. And so that's what I did. This gathered more reviews than I think every other review site in existence out there combined for web hosting. And it put together a pretty good picture of what people thought of all the various web hosting companies. So that was the original idea behind ReviewSignal, was let's do some honest web hosting reviews. I sort of got sidetracked into the WordPress world, and that's where we know each other from. A few years into it, somebody basically asked, it was Jeff King at GoDaddy at the time, said, our WordPress hosting is as fast as anyone else in the industry. This was probably a decade ago, maybe more. And I said, really? Are you willing to let me test that? And so we did. And that was the first WordPress hosting benchmarks I ever did. That's become probably bigger than the review site. Not probably, absolutely is bigger than the review site. People were more interested in me benchmarking, testing, and doing kind of objective performance evaluations of WordPress hosting companies. And so that's kind of what I became known for in this WordPress space. Those are
that's
the
really
kind of,
cool.
that's the big things behind ReviewSignal.
Yeah, and I would
a
definitely
bunch
say
of
that
other-
ReviewSignal has carried a level of integrity that I haven't seen in other websites that review hosting companies. Do you take affiliate fees when people sign up for hosting?
Yep. I sign up. If a company has an affiliate program, I will sign up and certainly take the money.
Yeah. But does that drive the results?
Nope. There's
Right.
plenty of companies on there that don't have affiliate programs and do well. One funny story about that was when I first built the original ReviewSignal, the top rated company didn't have an affiliate program. It was called A Small Orange and they eventually got acquired by Endurance, which is Bluehost now.
Yep.
Newfold now, merged into many others throughout that time. But I had to go to the CEO and basically beg him, will you please create an affiliate program for me? He says, I don't believe in affiliate programs. They're all scammy and terrible. Or the review sites that are using them. So, and I was like, I know, I agree. But if I launch this website, you're first and you don't have an affiliate program, this business is going to die before it's born. So
yeah, it's
if
a
you want
hard
to see
balance
that
for you to strike.
change, if you want to see that change, I need you. And so I was the first and only affiliate for a long time, because otherwise that would have been an absolute, I think, nightmare. And they would have paid me $5 or $10 a sale. Well,
yeah, geez. And that actually speaks to the overall reason that we're here today, right? Is how do you strike that balance with getting the funding that you need and raising the capital that you need to keep open source projects or projects that are good for the community going, but without having it compromise the integrity of what it is that you're trying to build or release too much influence or anything like that. But I think that ReviewSignal has definitely carried a strong word of mouth in and of itself. People are constantly talking about it at conferences and places that I visit as a way to get unbiased, objective hosting reviews. So thank you for doing that. It's a really good contribution to the community.
Yeah, I agree. I think benchmarking is one of the hardest things to do properly. It's very easy to get into the bench marketing role instead of the benchmarking one.
I like that, bench marketing.
That's a good one. I had not heard that before. And I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges that I see. Because if we're being honest, I don't think anyone's come close to doing the level of benchmarking I've done of hosts, but I do see people trying and using, I'm going to say, benchmarks that are not good. I would say 90% of them don't even have like a basic methodology, or the 10% that do, they're weak. They're not scientific. They're not thought out beforehand. It's sort of an add-on that maybe fits a narrative.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm looking forward to exploring more with you on the science and the technology behind your benchmarking tools. Vic, thank you for joining after such a long flight. I hope you're still excited to be here. Awesome. Let's hear about you and MariaDB.
Okay, so first of all, I'll give a brief introduction about the history of MariaDB and how I came to work at the MariaDB Foundation. So as you may or may not know, MariaDB is an open source database, a fork of MySQL. It was built and is still being built by the original developers of MySQL. So Monty, the original author of MySQL, he wrote the first line of code, I think somewhere in the 80s.
No kidding.
I think some of those lines are even still in MariaDB now.
And the name Origin, is that Monty's daughter? Is that right? Or am I remembering that wrong?
Monty likes to name his projects after his daughters.
Okay.
So his first daughter called Mu, spelled M-Y, that added the prefix to SQL, so MySQL. And of course, his second son is Max. There's a database called MaxDB. And the third child, Maria, and now we have MariaDB.
Nice.
Does he have any more children?
Do you want more databases?
I don't know, but is there more to name them?
Well, I think Monty said that he has dogs if he doesn't have children anymore, so you'll never know.
Nice.
So I started with MariaDB more than 10 years ago. So I was a student back then, and I wanted to contribute to open source. I tried contributing to Mozilla first, but that was a little bit hard. The code was really difficult to start off with. But I did get a contribution to Mozilla first. But it just so happened that MariaDB was part of this Google Summer of Code project that encouraged open source contributions. So I participated back in 2013, I think. Yeah, 2013. I coded something very cool that made it into MariaDB 4 or 5 months later. And I was basically hooked after that. Getting code into MariaDB is also challenging, but I find it much more rewarding now that I actually can get it consistently, and I can also help others get code into MariaDB. Currently, I am acting as Chief Development Officer in MariaDB Foundation. So the MariaDB server is now backed by a foundation called MariaDB Foundation. We own the trademark of MariaDB server, and we make sure that MariaDB server is always available as an open source project. We guide contributions, and we ensure that there is always a MariaDB server. And we could not do this without the help of our sponsors, which Automatic is one of the foundation sponsors, I might add.
Thanks for that plug.
We're talking about corporations giving back to open source. Automatic is doing their share, and I'm very glad for that. And I hope that with this podcast, we can convince more to do the same.
Yeah.
We have lots of projects now in MariaDB. I am supervising or leading or helping various projects succeed. We have our CI/CD infrastructure to make sure that MariaDB is properly tested, that there's no regressions, no performance degradation for every push that we do. And we're working on a project called Catalogs. More on that probably later. And we've just released a very cool feature, AI-focused vector search in MariaDB a couple of weeks ago. That was a very cool achievement. I hope to talk a bit more about that. We basically beat the competition performance-wise, and I couldn't be more proud of it.
That's great. Awesome. All right. So before we dive in, I have a quick question. This is for both of you. What is the first technology you remember using that was open source? Kevin, why don't you go first?
Sure. Two come to mind by name. I think OpenOffice was maybe one of them. Not paying for Office was a big deal 20 years ago or whatever. And
this is like a Microsoft Office alternative.
Yeah, I think OpenOffice may still exist, but everybody uses LibreOffice now. It's just the Office set of tools, but open source and free. And the other one that I remember was PHP Nuke, which was a super early, like 90s content management system. And I think there was a whole bunch of other applications that I use, and I don't remember the names of. I feel like I probably installed 100 different open source blogs, forums, I don't know, PHPBB, stuff like that. A lot of,
sure,
I remember lots of them. Yeah, lots. I was setting up a lot of websites, and I wanted to do all sorts of stuff. And then you'd have to try, you had your installer. It might have been like Softaculous or something like that, where it's like, oh, there's like 50 of them. Okay, I'm just going to start playing with them.
Yeah. That's cool. How about you, Vic?
Okay, for me, it definitely has to be the whole LAMP stack.
Yeah.
So as I was starting to learn programming, somebody told me install PHP and I installed PHP and then like nothing's working. Oh, you also need Apache.
Yeah.
Oh, and you also need a database. Back then it was MySQL, I think 3.23 was when I was installing it. And it was on Windows, and that was the cool thing because it did work on Windows back then. I no longer use Windows now, but it's actually it was a good to have that installer then.
It's pretty amazing when you think about how much of the internet is actually powered by open source technology. In the WordPress industry, we think about WordPress as being open source and having a huge impact on the internet as a whole because of how much market share it has. But underneath WordPress is a variety of tools and features and things that all are built on open source. And for me, I got started building websites in the mid 90s as a way for me to get out of having to scoop ice cream or pump gas as a teenager's job trying to make money. So I guess technically HTML and CSS, which are open source, were my first endeavors in there. But what really blew my mind was when I could use PHP to do imports of HTML files so that I didn't have to constantly make changes to the same header or footer of a website a dozen or more times when they have tons of pages. And I remember that blowing my mind. But then later in, I think 2004, 2005, I had a professor tell me to try WordPress, and that was it, that my whole career trajectory changed because of WordPress. And when you think about, I'm still a romantic about the internet. You go back to the 90s and it was such a fun opportunity to test the waters with the internet and play and build things. And, in the early 2000s, I was building Flash websites. I got into game development online, things like that. But there was so much of the internet that was being built in real time back then. And there were so many experiments being run and different ways to interact with it. And then, you get passionate about the fact that you're empowering people to have a voice online, whether you're, anywhere on the globe, no matter what your economic situation is, your social stance, any of that stuff. The internet is a place for you to have a voice. And that is really what drove me to do more and more within the internet. And open source technology is like a perfect parallel with all of that.
Oops, sorry. Could I jump
No,
in
go
there
for
a
it,
sec?
Kevin. Yeah.
Your PHP moment reminded me of kind of a moment when I first started using PHP, and it was that magical moment of, I had written Perl before that, or tried to, very poorly. What a terrible experience. Sorry, Perl developers. I feel bad. But there was something magical about that moment where you went from that HTML, because that's what I learned first. I learned CSS. Yep. I still don't know CSS. But there was that magic moment of like, I can put in some code here in the middle of this HTML, and then it's actually there and dynamic and doing something like right away. Like that was maybe the aha moment as I learned to become a software developer and, trying to build stuff like that. That was so cool. And I don't even think about, at least not then, and even now when you ask the question, I don't think of PHP as being the first open source thing I used. It's sort of that piping, the foundation that you don't even think about. And I think that kind of perfectly highlights what you've been wanting to talk about. There's so much open source powering so much that we don't even think about. We often only think about that high layer stuff, WordPress or my PHP new, that's what jumped to mind. But right there in the name was PHP. I was using a different open source powering it, and that didn't even jump to my head.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's something that flies under the radar for sure. I remember back then I was building a website for a local grocery store, and they wanted to have pages for every type of food that they were offering because they made all this custom stuff. And in order to keep my prices down and actually win the business, I had to figure out a way to create more dynamic elements. So like it was actually the monetary prioritization there that forced me to look at PHP as a way to create dynamic headers and footers so that I could actually get the job done in a reasonable amount of time and actually make money off of it. So it was like a perfect genesis moment for me where open source was actually helping me to make money. And as a teenager, it kind of it built that as a foundation into my future life. All right, so let's dive into some questions about open source. Vic, when you think about the opportunities out there, and we just talked about all the different technologies out there that are open source, what suggestions would you have for helping people to get started in contributing back to open source? And this could be, from a technical perspective, or it could be for non-developers out there who may not have their hands in code that they work in every single day, but they do want to give back. They do want to, further endow these open source projects. So what do you think?
Okay. So that is a very good question. Let's start with the developers first, because I think that's the easy one. It's more straightforward, but then I'll focus on the other group as well. So for developers, basically, is there something in any project that you're using that doesn't fit your need? Go and find the community around the project. They usually have a mailing list, or a Discord channel, or a Slack channel, whatever. There's lots of ways that companies or open source projects communicate. You just need to find which one that project is using, and then just ask around. My experience in open source is that people are very friendly, and they want to get more contributions. We might not have time to review your contributions on time. It's always a chicken and egg problem, and actually finding the time to do it. But we do want contributions. So you are very likely to get positive response just for asking, hey, I think this is missing. Would you like me to try and fix it? Do you know of a way to fix it? How should I go about it? And usually the maintainer will just guide you to how to approach the problem. It's better to try to talk first and then code, instead of just immediately submitting a patch out of the blue. We get that every now and then, and it's somewhat hard to understand exactly what the contributor wants. So talk first, code after.
That can be a little intimidating, though, reaching out to someone who's contributing to a big open source project. Is there a specific way you would recommend opening those lines of communication?
Just ask.
Just ask.
Don't be afraid. What's the worst that they can say? No, go away. Really?
True. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Vic, about that. You're talking about very large open source projects. What about small?
Not just very large ones. No.
I was going to say, is there a difference between smaller ones and bigger ones of the approach and how people might be able to contribute?
I mean, in the end, we're still the same human beings on the other end of the internet. So communication is key. Just talk to the people. They have a code of conduct. Usually they have, if it's a big project. If it's a small project, maybe they didn't have time to set up all the proper how to interact with the project documentation. Just ask. And there's no, as long as you're civil and you don't offend anyone, go for it.
It's great.
Just remember that I think the key is not to be demanding, because most of these open source projects, they're not getting paid to take your contribution. So it's a best effort kind of. If they have time, they will reply. If not, give them the benefit of the doubt. It's very likely that they want to respond. They just didn't get the time yet.
I think that's a really good thing to point out there, and something that I've seen in a variety of communities where this software exists and it may be free, but the fact that people are using it, sometimes they feel like they have a hard time separating the software that they're using, that they're getting for free, from something that they might be paying for. Because a lot of times, like WordPress is a great example. It's a sophisticated bit of software that has a huge community behind it, and it's powering some of the highest trafficked websites in the world. And so based on that, you have this assumption that the WordPress community is going to support it in a way that's, bespoke to you. And I've seen this a lot, where someone will enter the open source community and ask questions as if they're owed something by the community. And I think that measuring the way in which you're reaching out to people and being, polite, as you said, but also just being cognizant of the fact that these are people who are giving back to a set of software or writing code. So you have something to use and not always getting paid for it. They might be volunteers. They might be contributing their own free time to it. And so, having an entitled mentality that you're owed something because you're using the software is not going to get you very far. I'm not saying that's a common thing, but it is something that I have run into a few times in the past.
And usually these projects, if you do want dedicated support, they have a dedicated paid for support offering. That's usually how you make money in open source. You build an open source project, you get lots of users. And if you have lots and lots of users, even if 1% of them pay, you can keep going, keep the lights on. And it's about identifying if you are in the 1% or the 99%.
Right. We'll get back to the 99% and the 1% because I think that's a good thing to touch on. But let's finish the question. How would you recommend non-developers get into this?
Okay, so for non-developers, one thing that most projects are lacking is proper documentation and proper documentation in other language except English. So if you speak Spanish, Italian, Chinese, since I've been to China, that's actually a pretty big problem. Most Chinese do not speak English. So if you can have your documentation in the language that your user knows, you get much more adoption. So if you use the project and you like it and you can understand the English documentation and if you are good at writing, you should contribute documentation because that is tremendously helpful.
Now, I have my own personal opinions about this, but do you think there is a direct correlation between adoption and further contribution back to the program or to the software? In other words, the more people who adopt it, the more likely you're going to get increased engagement on contribution.
Well, you'd think that is the case, and it does correlate to some degree, but I think it's a little bit in the hands of the project maintainers as well. So it's very important to have a welcoming environment to encourage more contributions. So it's the more users you get, the bigger the chance of getting more contributions, but you have to encourage them. Otherwise,
right. You have to create a clear path for them to be able to contribute. Otherwise, you're just going to lose them.
Exactly.
Yep.
Another thing that made MySQL successful, and at MariaDB, we still rely on it. When you have so many users, reporting bugs is really, really helpful, especially if the bug report is detailed enough to where the developers can actually reproduce the issue. So
that's key. Yeah, don't submit a bug report that just says this didn't work for me. Tell us about the browser you're using, the phone you're using, what version you're on, how you got to that step, where you came from. It's so complex, the number of ways in which someone can get to a specific user interface view, right? So helping them to trace that back steps is important.
And that's how you actually get a much better project. That's actually one of the advantages of having free software because you get much more adoption. Users are very creative when it comes to using your product. They will find ways to break it that you've never even imagined.
Yep, that's true. All right. So let me talk, Kevin, let me ask you a question. So you're embarking now on starting an open source project. You've been working in the WordPress world for a while, but you have the technology that helps you to benchmark these sites. You're going to actually go on, turn it into an open source bit of technology, make it available to the world. So you're just getting started funding an open source project. How's that going? And how are you going to get the funds you need to actually make this work?
So let's start by just saying the project is named Orderly Ape, and it's a load testing tool. And that name might sound weird. It was a play on Chaos Monkey, which is the Netflix tool to randomly destroy infrastructure and make sure that you have resilient infrastructure through chaos. Orderly Ape is the exact opposite. It's load testing. So you're saying, here are the parameters that we think are going to happen and we're preparing for, and you build a test to simulate a known situation. So It's the exact opposite.
Black Friday.
Right. So you're a e-commerce store. Black Friday's coming. You say we have a mailing list of 1 million users. We know our click-through rate is 40% on a whatever. Therefore, over this period of time, we're to get this many clicks, our server's gonna catch on fire. Because so the only way to really know that is to test it, which is what load testing is. And what I am building is the load testing software itself exists. There's open source library or tool, whatever you want to call it, project called K6. That's what I've been using for the benchmarks I do at WP hosting benchmarks for many years now. And that tool is open source, but we used to use their commercial cloud. And what the cloud did was it allowed you to run much larger tests, distribute them geographically, scale, and it would collect all that data and give you a nice view of it too. Whereas the out-of-the-box K6 experience it's running off a single server, and it just kind of gives you a command line output. So that's really nice, quick, whatever. It's nowhere near this cloud experience where you want to run things at scale and test geographies and blah, 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 and actually look at the data and make sure, oh yeah, I want to be able to easily dig in and see like, oh, what is that spike? What's happening there? Let me understand more than just one dump of a command line of here's the average response time. Like, that's cool, but yeah. So what has happened is K6 Cloud was acquired by Grafana, and the prices have gone up dramatically. And so I can no longer afford to run the benchmarks at their public rates. It would be over $250,000 to do my benchmarks. And nobody wants to pay that, and I don't have that much money. So the question became, what next? K6 is open source. Grafana is open source, the dashboards. And then there's all sorts of databases. We're using InfluxDB is open source. So there's all these open source tools, and the project is putting these together and building that glue to let you run those same sort of load tests at scale. And distribute them geographically and collect all that data, visualize it, having your own, it's on your own hardware too. So you can run it at any scale at pennies on the dollar in comparison to running it on somebody else's cloud where they're charging you insane rates. So that's the project.
So there's both infrastructure costs, but there's also development costs, right? And do you have a team of people working with you? Is it you by yourself?
It is not me by myself, thank God, because otherwise this would go nowhere. I am working with 2 guys, also from Romania, run a shop called Bitpoke. They used to be founders at Press Labs, the WordPress hosting company, and they separated out and have been doing Kubernetes consulting, and they had built load testing software before to participate in my benchmarks using a different library, but they were very comfortable and experienced of, oh yeah, we kind of built most of that already. I was like,
yep.
Oh, so let me hire you to build the foundation of this. And so, yeah, I'm working with the 2 of them, Mile and Calvin.
Nice.
And
so now you're looking for funding for this project, and how's that going?
Very slow, for being honest. Yeah. Everybody seems really excited to, oh yeah, that sounds like really helpful. I even had multiple companies and people come to me complaining about this Grafana acquisition and the prices going up. People come and say, oh yeah, our prices went up an order of magnitude. Okay. Like, oh, well, when many people tell you that, you're like, oh, well, that seems like an easy ask then. Here, just give a little bit of funding and we build you one, and these are all hosting companies. You have your own infrastructure. Your hardware costs are probably near zero for most of them because you've already got servers sitting there. So if I build this and all you need to do is install it, this seems like a no-brainer. But once you ask for a check, it gets really quiet, I noticed so far.
Yeah.
So we've
So-
signed one company, and it's Pressable, which is an automatic company, who's the first to sign up and give. Cloudways has accepted us into their open source program and given us a bunch of credit to use so we can spin up the Kubernetes clusters and nodes to test and run all this stuff. So that was helpful as well.
So,
yeah.
so this is not an easy thing to fundraise for open source technology, especially when you're a passionate developer trying to get this project off the ground. You want to be writing code, you want to be working on the project, and now all of a sudden you have to put your business and funding hat on and go out into the world and try to make some money. And that can also feel a little bit conflicting with the open source mission, which it's not. And I think it's important for people to understand that, like, open source technology doesn't mean that it has to, doesn't need to generate funds or revenue or create big businesses and pay salaries. So yeah, I think that's great that you're working on this project. And I think we'll circle back to that because I want to talk more about it. But I think it's something that we all need to learn a little bit more about the responsibility that we have to open source technology. Vic, when we talk about MariaDB, I know there's a commercial element to it, but how do you guys keep the lights on? How are you paying for development time and all that stuff? How does MariaDB generate funds?
Okay, so a little bit of clarification first. So there are two entities right now. There's the MariaDB Foundation and the MariaDB PLC, the for-profit entity. So the for-profit entity has a business model around support contracts, and they can also do NRE, like non-recurrent engineering. They themselves contribute about 80% of the code to MariaDB server. So you could say that their business model is sustainable. For the MariaDB Foundation, which is where I work, we have a little bit of a different problem, very similar to what Kevin here has. So we are, being a nonprofit, we cannot do paid for work. We rely on sponsorships, donations. And we have managed to convince companies, big companies like Intel, Amazon, Automatic, of course, that MariaDB is such a foundational project for them that it makes sense to invest into it so that you have your business guaranteed long term. That is the value that MariaDB specifically provides, but this generally holds true for most big open source projects, and in a way, even the smaller ones too. So that's how we keep the lights on.
Yeah.
And you'd be surprised how important having people able to answer contributors and to review code properly. You might have seen on the news a couple of months ago, there was this very intricate social engineering attack in, I think, libzstd, where there was such a weird pressure from a contributor. Why haven't you reviewed this? Why haven't you done this? To the point where they managed to get into an open source project malware. So, and that was just banking on the fact that there are not enough resources in open source projects. Luckily, this was caught by an engineer at Microsoft, but this could have gone so much worse. So
Actually, that speaks to
that is the reason why you need to invest into open source.
That speaks to my next question. So I have a question for both of you, and I might dive in here too as well. But what do you think is the responsibility that companies who make money off of open source have to contribute back to it? Whether that might be financially, giving employees time, promoting the products. Do you feel that a hosting company that's selling WordPress or another company that might be using MariaDB or doing benchmark testings on your future product, Do you think they have an actual responsibility to that open source and endowing it for the future? I'll leave that open to either one of you to jump in.
I can jump in then. I think there is some responsibility, but it's really difficult to say how much and who has that responsibility. At the very, very big end, I think it's obvious. The largest companies gaining the absolute most out of it need to support them. It's sort of as you get further down the food chain, smaller and smaller companies, I think it gets harder. If you're a hosting company and let's say, WordPress is often a big component for many hosting companies. But then we just talked about the entire LAMP stack or all these other projects like MariaDB, PHP, like who do they owe all of it to? Is it a chunk? I think it gets tricky to say, our business is built on the backs of maybe a dozen projects, or maybe it's hundreds. Like if you started looking at all the libraries that you were using for every component, who gets those resources? How is it allocated? What's the most important? I don't have a great answer, but it's a really
I think that's a good
question.
start. Yeah, it's a right move in the right direction. Vic, do you have anything there?
Yeah, so I've kind of already mentioned this social engineering attack. Like the whole of the internet is relying on this one person holding this little brick such that the whole house of cards doesn't come tumbling down. So I say that is the responsibility that for-profit companies using open source have to embrace. Basically, if every open source company allocated maybe 1% of the total revenue is too much, but 0.1%, if they all dedicated that back to open source, we would be in a much better place.
For sure.
And in the end, it would even improve their bottom line because they would have better tools to work with. And they do
Not to
work with
mention
them.
the fact that if they were actually contributing people back to the projects, they would have influence over the roadmap, what gets added as new features. If they want to expand in a certain area or in a different direction, they would actually be able to start writing the code itself to give back to that open source project.
Yeah. And actually, I have a very good story from China because I just came back. So in China, there are now 270 plus MySQL or MariaDB forks. Everyone is taking a random version of MySQL and MariaDB and putting some features on top. And then because they don't contribute back these changes, now they're stuck maintaining those features as they have to update the server to make sure there's no security vulnerabilities. So they're creating more works for themselves by not giving back.
Yeah, that's a tough situation to be in.
Instead of being able to focus on the customer experience, like offer the best support you can give your customer, because in the end, you're offering the service. The database, in MariaDB's case, is just part of the tool chain. You should focus on optimizing the customer experience. Let the open source developers take care of your patch once it's landed into the project.
Yep. So one thing I'll add to this discussion is that I think at its core, I think, Kevin, you're right. It's not easy to define exactly how much or how to contribute back. And I would definitely be fearful of a world where WordPress got forked hundreds of times instead of people just deciding to contribute back to it. But I think at its core, I think what we can say is that any kind of company out there that is leveraging an open source product has a responsibility to make sure that they're actually giving it back to the world in a way that's a responsible and beneficial situation. I'll give you an example. If a hosting company is using WordPress and they're promoting themselves as a hosting company that offers managed hosting for WordPress, and they're providing a really terrible experience, but they have the capital to go out and acquire tons of customers through advertising, and they have an easy onboarding setup, but they're providing just a terrible experience. That can become the first and only experience that user has with WordPress. And then they end up maybe not going to another hosting company and trying WordPress again, but instead going to another platform altogether. And if that's a closed source platform, that's not good for the internet as a whole. And that's a disservice to the actual community, because you're now taking away what could have been a positive WordPress experience and forcing them to migrate and change platforms altogether. So maybe it's not as simple and clear cut to say that like X percentage of your funds has to go back to every layer of open source technology you're using. But I think at the very least, you need to honor the work that goes into that open source code and projects to make sure that you're delivering it back to customers in a way that is beneficial to the ecosystem. Cool.
Okay.
Nice. I like
kind
that.
of
All
feels
right.
like philanthropy in a way, where the ones with the resources should morally be giving back to the community.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, WordPress has 5 for the future, which is the idea that if you're a company that's making a decent amount of money off of WordPress, it's a core element of your product offering, that you should be contributing 5% back to the community. That could be monetarily, it could be sponsoring developers, it could be sponsoring individual projects. There could be a variety of ways in which you give back. And 5% is not a whole lot. But I think there's so much more that we can start to, we should be expecting from companies, because not a lot, or rather not as many as there should be, are taking part in that program. And it becomes challenging when a company just thinks that this open source technology will always be there for them. And if they're thinking that they can pivot at any moment to something else, it's not going to be that easy, and that's irresponsible to the ecosystem. All right, so we're going to keep going here, but I do want to just mention that we got 2 questions that were written in to us. So Dan is asking Kevin a question. And Kevin, you may or may not have an answer for this, because this kind of touches on the idea of what makes a good hosting company versus not. But here's the question. What are the most positive/promising and negative/concerning new developments or trends in WordPress hosting? And then continues, over the course of ReviewSignal's history, how has the industry gotten better and or worse?
That is a large question.
That's a big question.
Or a series of questions. So positive.
Maybe I can actually rephrase it just to help kind of solidify this. What is something that is promising, a new development and trends of WordPress that you're excited for?
For me, the work I do, the benchmarking, the testing, hosting companies, everybody's getting faster. Every time I look, comparing year over year, some perform better than others, as you always expect, and there may be an outlier or two, but the trend is unequivocally faster. And even, companies where I'm seeing like averages of like 10 milliseconds on some tests, and I'm thinking, there's got to be a limit to this, right? Like we're approaching 0, but somehow every year somebody keeps going faster and faster. We are approaching 0. It's got to stop at some point. But
Sure.
It's been 10 years and we still keep going. So
yeah, I saw this interesting graphic where they had compared the 100-meter, I think it was the 100-meter run from the Olympics in the early 1900s to today. And they had the 2 individuals running along like as if they were one on top of each other. And even though we've had such crazy improvements in the way in which people train, the shoes that they wear, the clothing, all that stuff, the tracks have changed. There was only a few milliseconds of difference between the top performer 100 years ago to today. But those milliseconds are what changes you from winning gold or going home with no medal at all. So I think that's interesting that we're getting closer and closer to a place where we may not even be able to go any faster.
I keep thinking we're going to get there, but we keep going faster, and that's amazing. Like, that's at the very fastest end. You're getting people approaching that, but we're getting more and more of them approaching that too. And somehow each year,
that's great.
Somebody is faster than any number I had the year before. And that blows my mind. Awesome. And if I look back 10 years ago when we started, it's massive. It's not like your Olympic thing where
Or
humans
it's
are
a
still
milliseconds.
humans.
Yeah.
Internet engineering has just gone crazy and is
Oh, for sure.
a marvel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I think you answered both of those questions. The other question that Dan had is actually directed at me, but anyone feel free to jump in here. What should WordPress hosts be doing to deliver better security for their customers? Is this an area where we're lagging? What/where are the positive trends? Also, to what extent is it necessary to improve security in WP Core? And is there a role for hosts in doing that? Another lengthy question from Dan, but Dan, I really appreciate you writing in. So here's the thing. I'm going to answer this question from a different perspective. I actually co-founded a company called Parka about 10 years ago, and we built Brute Protect, which is a cloud-powered brute force protection service. The idea there was that the most vulnerable place a WordPress site has is the user's password. When people can create a password ABC123, it doesn't matter how strong your vault door is if they can just open it just by guessing. So what we set out to do was to identify attack vectors from different hosts and use that collaborative data to create a real-time blacklist, whereas previously hosting companies would only be working within their own knowledge and attack vectors to update their own blacklist. This was a collaborative effort. Anyone using the plugin was updating that blacklist in real time. And it was a really great opportunity to leverage the benefits from working together with hosting companies. But I'll tell you this, I think a variety of hosting companies are doing amazing things with security, hardening security, applying additional services on top. I think some companies give you a blank slate and put it up to the user to figure out how to deal with security. I think beyond anything else, what you need to do is be transparent with your customers. There is an assumption that every user out there has that their sites are backed up, that they're inherently secure. There's a misunderstanding about whether or not viruses or malicious code can even exist on a server. There is a huge misconception in the industry that why would anybody want to hack my little shop? I own a hair salon in rural wherever, and nobody even knows about me. Why would they want to hack my site? The reality of the situation is they don't care about you as much as they care about the power behind your site to leverage that. You can become a zombie site. They can use that to get into other things and do other bad things out there. So I think more than anything, the host has a responsibility to educate the users about what security precautions they should be taking and to be transparent about what it is that the host is providing and not providing to them. Don't live off these assumptions and don't create a scenario where these customers are creating insecure platforms just because of the fact that it's just frankly miscommunication.
I agree there. I do want to add on top that educating users is one thing, but what I've seen, especially when it comes to keeping up with security patches, like users are usually very afraid of upgrading.
That's true.
And upgrading is the way you keep on top of all the attacks that happen every day. So one of the key things that hosting companies should do is they need to make sure that whatever upgrades they can do automatically, that they do them for the users and they don't cause outages. And when there is something more involved, like a database upgrade, maybe a major version PHP upgrade, maybe a major version WordPress upgrade, they should give the users the opportunity to try this, do A/B testing, have so the company that hosts now MariaDB.org has a shadow version of the website, so we can test the new version if it works. All of these are methods to encourage users to keep on top of the latest versions of the software they're using.
Yeah.
So that is the key that I find important in security.
No, that's a great point for sure. Okay, let's keep moving here. Kevin, we had a chance to talk about ReviewSignal, and I think we might have a little bit of time to double back there. But Vic, we haven't had a chance to really dive into what it is that MariaDB is working on right now. I'm really interested to hear about catalogs and vector search. So why don't you tell us what you're working on there and then help us to understand how we can actually help give back to those projects as well, whether it's through code contributions or financially.
Okay, so let's start the I think the project that interests hosting companies the most. So this might be catalogs. The easiest way to explain this is with a diagram. In that diagram, you will see that there's two ways you can do hosting with MariaDB. So either you have a database that is one instance per customer. So you have a VM that runs MariaDB, maybe WordPress as well, per customer. That provides the customer the best user experience they can get. The problem is that you have a lot of overhead with the VM. The fact that most of the websites that you have in your hosting portfolio probably don't get that much traffic. So they don't actually load the CPU much, but they do eat up the RAM, whether you like it or not. On the other end, you can have something like a cPanel deployment with a shared database server. So just one instance of MariaDB, but you have to give users a, let's say, limited flexibility. You either have to create users manually for them, or they don't have access to other databases than the database that their website is hosted on. So although that usually works for a traditional WordPress deployment, if you want to scale out a bit more and do more than just WordPress, you're kind of out of luck in that sort of scenario. The benefit of that is that the hosting company pays very little for hardware because most of the resources are shared. But as you see, there's a user experience problem. Catalogs is the solution to both of these situations, specifically for hosting providers. But I have talked with the enterprise customers, like big companies. They can make use of catalogs for coalescing multiple applications into one. So what catalogs are, you can think of them as containers of a database, of a server, but it's actually running within the database itself. So you don't get the overhead of separate VMs. You don't have extra buffers allocated for each customer. It's just one big buffer for all shared users. So you don't waste resources, but the user actually gets all of the possibilities that they would get with a dedicated instance. You can create users, they can create databases, schemas, allocate any part of the server to any part of their application.
And so would this result in performance improvements or in the ability to handle more requests at the same time, or both?
Actually, both. So one of the key benefits of catalogs is that there are features in MariaDB that without catalogs, it's very, very hard to figure out what is your noisy neighbor, which user out of this whole bunch is actually using most of the resources.
Yep.
Of course, you can do sort of tricks already. That's how hosting companies work now, but it's very hard. With catalogs, this becomes so much easier. So you need a little bit of development on the DevOps side to improve monitoring. But after that, you should be able to scale up your deployments by, let's say, 10 to 100x more users on the same hardware, assuming most of them are low traffic websites, which likely most of them are anyway.
Can I ask a question about this?
Go for it.
So what are the trade-offs to the current setups?
A VM of MariaDB server eats up about 1 gig of RAM per customer. So if you have a 256 gig server, that's 256 customers maximum. You could do 1,000 if you had catalogs enabled. And the other one, with a shared server, you have the drawback: user crashes the server, it crashes for all of them, and that is still a drawback. Catalogs, but that drawback comes with the user experience penalties, like I've mentioned. So catalogs will not solve a crashing server. You still have to restart for everyone. But on the other hand, upgrades are much easier because you can upgrade the server in full, like change the version, but the data directory, actually, you can upgrade individually. So you don't have to cause a downtime whilst you upgrade each and every user website. You can do them one at a time and save the pain of other users.
Interesting.
So it's just better user experience overall. And I can talk about backups and how you can stream from catalogs, but you probably have me yapping for about 2 hours. So
we can do a whole nother episode on that then. All right. So tell us about Vector.
Okay, so Vector is something we just released now. There is this whole craze in the industry now that you have to have AI in your whatever company does. It doesn't matter. It has to have
Frankly, in
AI.
everything, right? You have to have AI everywhere all the time.
LLMs like ChatGPT is smart. It can generate good responses for normal questions. But if you have something that's very specific to your system, like let's say you own a web shop and you want to sell something to a customer. The customer says, I want a coffee machine. Well, ChatGPT will say, pick this one. Well, it doesn't know that actually that's not the one you're selling. So you need this model to actually know what it is you're selling. And this is where the database comes in. You know your products, you have them there. The trick is, how do you map what the user asks for? I want a coffee machine, to what you have in your database. Because now you're no longer doing like Google like searches. You're actually doing something in natural language. With vector search, you convert the user question to a vector, and then in the database, you search for the corresponding vectors for your product. And this gives you very good semantic results. This technique is called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. You give the LLM, ChatGPT, here's the list of products I'm selling, answer the following user question. Give me a coffee machine is the question. And you'll get response tailored for your website. And we have this in MariaDB now, and there are competing databases. The thing that I'm very proud about is that MariaDB scales much better than all the other products on the market now. Well, except maybe a few, but most of them we scale much better with multiple queries. And this was one of those projects that has benefited from contribution from external companies. So we couldn't have gotten this out the door as quickly if it weren't for Amazon. They contributed both benchmarking code and insert in the delete algorithm for this. And we're basically out the door a month before we would have gotten otherwise.
So
yeah.
why did Amazon contribute that code? Was it for their own, like, was it a situation where they would actually benefit it from themselves, or they had it and they wanted to give back? Like, how did that happen?
Amazon is, of course, a big cloud provider, Amazon AWS.
Sure.
They offer MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres managed database services. The thing is that with MariaDB, we are the easiest of these three projects to work with and contribute to. And Amazon's goal is to make sure that they offer the best user experience and also beat any of the other competition to offering those extra features.
Sure.
If they contribute MariaDB Vector to MariaDB, they can then offer MariaDB Vector in their cloud first. And that gives them an edge. That's how they keep on top. So it's, in a way, it's one-to-one business opportunity.
And sometimes it's just a matter of inches, right? These companies benefit from being the first one out the gate, even if it's just by a few weeks or months, that can have a major impact for them.
Exactly. And that's why we've also tried to pitch catalogs in the same way. Catalogs is a bigger project when it comes to how much code we need to do. We want to give sponsors of catalogs the chance of being the first ones to guide the project and be able to integrate their stack with catalogs before anyone else. Because they work with us, they shape the project, they say, oh, I need this feature because it'll make this part of the migration process much easier. We listen and we can work with it.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for covering all that. We are closing in on an hour here, which is fantastic, if not over an hour. So I appreciate the great conversation. I have a couple minor questions, but before I jump in there, we're going to include in the show notes and the transcripts links to your respective projects and how people can give back. If people are listening to this and they're, let's say, in an agency or they're building websites for other people, one idea that comes to mind on how they might be able to actually contribute if they're small and they don't have the monetary ability, to create a monetary contribution or lend someone from their agency because it would make too much of a negative impact on them. I think at the very least they could do is share this opportunity with their hosting company. They could send a tweet out. They could submit a support ticket and encourage the hosting company that they're spending money with to contribute back to these projects. But do you have any other ways in which these people who are listening to this podcast could give back to you guys?
I'll let Kevin answer this one first.
Oh, I was waiting for you.
Is getting the word out enough? Like, if you're not a large corporation, if you're not sitting at home right now listening as the CEO of X hosting company, is helping to get the word out the best way to give back? Is there something else that we can think of?
So I think it depends at like what stage the project is. Mine is not even at a version 1. It's an alpha.
Yep.
It's still in development. The biggest thing is honestly, it needs funding so that I can keep paying the developers. That's not out of my pocket directly. To get this built and exist. That's the first thing. Once it's actually kind of at a point where people can start using it, getting the word out and all that will be very helpful. I'm going to need people to test it. Right now, there's 3 people on Earth that have used the software, the 2 developers and I.
Where can I test it? How can I test it?
So the GitHub repo is actually up. It's on the ReviewSignal GitHub. All the links.
We'll share that link.
Orderlyape.com. I did secure the domain name.
Nice.
We'll link to a page with a link to the GitHub, asking for sponsorship. All the details are there.
To Vic's point earlier, right? The more bugs you submit, the more testing you do, the more you use the product, the better you can make the open source project.
Vic was talking about getting documentation in other languages. We're still waiting to do English. The documentation is not there yet. Yeah, we're trying to build the project and then we'll get this documentation. It's such an early stage where money first, we need to build it. The next step is going to get people on board. I want to get people to test it. Vic, if you want to test it, we'll talk later once we actually know how to set it up properly for the next person and, all of this. Yeah, I have 2 lists. I have the people who want to give money and then the people who want to help in any other way.
And give time.
Yeah. And right now I'm honestly at the money stage, the give time. I want to get there as soon as possible because I want this project. We need people to actually look at it, install it, see that there's value and actually contribute. I think the community will be really small if I'm being honest, but I think it's going to be, a few people that are going to be really into it and see the value. And one
thing I've learned about you, Kevin, is that you're incredibly humble when it comes to this stuff. I think it's going to be a lot bigger than you think when people start to realize the opportunities they have to get ahead of this load testing and to be able to use it in open source fashion.
You got me so excited that I think I have feature requests for you.
Already. There we go.
If you manage to look at the project now and install it, I would be amazed. I'm not even sure if all the code that's necessary is in all the repos yet. Some of the infrastructure stuff may or may not be there already in some of the Docker images. I'm not even sure. Like,
I'm happy to give it a try. So I guess
I don't even there's not even a get started yet documentation. It's just a pile of code right now and some infrastructure stuff.
That's all right.
If you're at home and you're listening now and you work for a hosting company or another corporation that's leveraging open source technology or building websites or running websites, take a look at Orderly Ape and see if there's an opportunity to give back to Kevin's project. And then as far as MariaDB goes, Vic, is there anything left to talk about there in terms of how folks at home can contribute back?
Well, I kind of touched up on all the things that we're doing now. What I believe is the core challenge of MariaDB now is that MySQL is still a very strong brand. And I'm fairly certain that right now, even if you haven't really thought about it, you're probably using MariaDB and not MySQL because we are default in most distributions. So the more educating that you can do to your peers, to your friends, explain to them that MariaDB is in my mind, it is already, but we need to convince others. It is the successor to MySQL. Um, You've seen a recent MySQL release. It actually is laughable when it comes to new features. At MariaDB, we do many more features more frequently. We listen to the community. We do what users ask. So spread the word, educate users on MariaDB. That's the most that I can ask for, or one of the core challenges we have that you will help solve, and that only the community can help solve this.
That's a really important point that we didn't get to touch on today, which is attribution and making sure that people know what the products are that you're using. And it's also really important to make sure that you're doing it right so that you are guarding against bad actors out there who might be trying to lure people in on products that are fake or faux products, malicious versions of products out there. We see this all the time with WordPress as well. There's fair use of the trademark, for example, but people go out and they use it any way they want to and they leverage it and they're not giving back to the community. So I think it's really important to make sure that you're attributing back to the open source code and recognizing the work that goes into it. All right, so we're at the end here. The last thing I want to ask, I met both of you in person for the first time at CloudFest in Germany. I believe that's true. Vic, for you, I think that's definitely true. Kevin, you and I can remember hanging out in the lobby of that hotel talking about Orderly Ape. It was an honor to get to meet you both there. I personally love CloudFest. I think it's an amazing conference. It's a lot of fun, and it's a great way to get people together. But what do you want to tell folks at home in terms of where they might run into you at another conference? What are your favorite conferences? What news sites are you reading? How are you keeping your finger on the pulse of the industry? Feel free to share one or many ideas. Vic, why don't you go first since you put Kevin on the spot last time?
Oh, sorry, I didn't. So the conferences that I usually attend are open source focused ones. So I go to, well, I attend FOSDEM every year. We had a little bit of a problem this year. They didn't accept the MySQL and MariaDB dev room. So a little bit of a disappointment there. But as an open source conference, it's one of the biggest ones in Europe. So I highly recommend you attend that one. CloudFest, of course, it's a very big conference. And I guess look out for the conferences related to your technology, like PyCon for Python. Those are usually where you get the most bang for your buck. Resources wise, I usually search for lots of things online. Maybe I stumble on something on Hacker News on Reddit. All my traffic is in a way tracked by Google. So actually most of my news I get from Google News now. I just have to be very careful to tell Google what I do want to see and what I don't want to see. And that's actually, I think, gives me a pretty good grasp of what happens in the IT sector worldwide.
Awesome. Kevin?
So I don't attend a lot of conferences. We met at CloudFest. That was the first time I've ever been.
No kidding.
Yeah. The only conference I think I've consistently attended for the past many years is WordCamp Europe. And I've stopped in at the US and Asia as well, but not consistently. So those are the only, you don't find me in person a whole lot. I tended to avoid conferences for a long time until I was asked to speak at one. That was like, oh, I guess I have to show up if I'm going to talk. But yeah, right now I'm living in Asia and I don't think there's a whole lot of conferences that I'm aware of that are targeted around me. WordCamp Asia is a big one. And
Vic's
Vic's
gonna
gonna tell me I have to go somewhere.
A quick plug, we're actually doing a conference. So at MariaDB, we do conferences twice a year at least. The next one is in India. It would be awesome to have you there, give a talk about Orderly Ape.
So
I'm sure people would love to
Look at
hear
that
you.
obligation you already have now to go and speak at that conference.
I mean, I'll talk about one of the challenges of attending conferences. is my business is just me. There's no bigger sponsor. There's no whatever. Anytime you see me, I think Johnny Harris, I think, had a nice post on Twitter about basically saying, I'm spending my own money to be there and my time. It's the same. Like, it's not easy. It's a lot of commitment between the travel, the hotels, everything that's coming out of. And you're going to say you sponsor people coming to visit?
We have sponsored students to come to our conferences. I'm sure we can figure something out. So
When people say that, I'm like, oh, that's far more likely to show up is, when you're asked to speak and if they're willing to at least cover you to get there to speak. That makes such a big difference. And I think that's one of the actual challenges, especially around WordCamp. Like I love going to WordCamp Europe. I feel like there's some tension between it wanting to be this for everybody conference, and it's also kind of missing that professional, like, let's bring in some of the best people. There's this kind of anti-money feeling to it.
Well,
which is
WordCamps
great
have
and
had
nice.
this long, they have a long tradition, right, of making it incredibly affordable. You look at other tech
Yeah,
conferences, you can spend $2,000 a ticket. I think
that's why I go to it,
WordCamps,
because I can afford it.
WordCamps have traditionally been like $40, and I think they got approval to go up to 100 or something like that recently. But for a long time, I've run several WordCamps myself, and I can tell you, as a former speaker on the circuit who used to get paid to go and speak at conferences, I do miss that aspect of it. But the other side of it too is that the WordCamps have they have a focus on curriculum based talks, right? So the idea is to educate and to highlight individuals in the community who may be giving back or have something interesting to talk about. And then, on the other side of it, CloudFest is a very commercially driven conference, right? And
Yeah.
we love going. It's an amazing conference, but at the end of the day, like, it is driven by the commercial aspects of the sponsorships and the folks who are showing up to give back to that conference. So there's a balance there. I'll be at WordCamp US at my next conference. So if anybody wants to hang out and talk there, I will be there. Thank you both so much for taking the time to meet with us. I think we've just scratched the surface on your respective projects and the fun of open source. So I would love to have you both back, and we can continue those conversations. And then, just so everybody knows, our next episode of Impressive Hosting, we're going to have Joshua Good and Vic Patel from Pressable. Joshua's from WP Cloud, the product that I work on at Automatic. And we're going to be talking about what it takes to get a hosting company going. And that'll be much more focused on helping agencies, small companies, resellers out there who want to get into hosting and how to get that going. Thank you both for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having us.
it was a pleasure talking today.
Thank you.